Welcome to the Empowerment Show with Melissa Heisler. Every week, discover new personal choices with practical, inspiring guides. And now, here's Melissa.
Well, happy Tuesday, all, and welcome to the Empowerment Show. I'm Melissa Heisler, Empowerment Coach at It's My Life, and it is your life. Live it. Today, I'm joined by Barbara Joan Zeitz. She is a women's historian and the author of A Thesaurus of Women from Cherry Blossoms to Cell Phones. To join our conversation, you can post your questions at facebook.com/The Empowerment Show. So let me tell you a little bit about Barbara Joan Zeitz. She is a women's historian, author, and presenter. Barbara earned a master's in women's studies and law from Roosevelt University in 2003. She writes a monthly column for the AAUW Illinois, which can be found at writeherhistory.wordpress.com. In 2012, Barbara self-published her first book, A Thesaurus of Women from Cherry Blossoms to Cell Phones, and it's available at independent bookstores, online at Amazon and Barnes & Noble, and personally through Barbara for her website or email. So welcome to the show, Barbara.
Oh, thank you, Melissa. Thank you for asking me to join you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, we're thrilled to have you. I know you have a lot of great information to share with us today. And I was wondering if we could start by talking a little bit about how did you become researching and writing about women's history?
Well, the way I became interested in it actually started in my undergraduate work at Roosevelt University during the 1990s. At the time I was majoring in Spanish. And as you know, when you major in a language, you really only study the language grammatically, like the first 1 or 2 years in the earlier courses. And then when you get into the advanced area, you no longer study the language but in a grammatical fashion, but rather through classes of literature, poetry, film, etc. At the time, I was also minoring in the history of minorities. So I was looking at the history of a lot of different cultures: Spanish, Native American, Indian, African American, Asian, etc. And across the board, in all of these courses, I was seeing a gender disparity. And so, of course, my interest was piqued. And when I graduated and received my BA, Roosevelt University had just begun a Women's Studies Master's program. And it was suggested that I enter that, and which I did. So that's really kind of how I got interested and started in it all.
So that's very interesting that you found differences that there was a gender disparity throughout different cultures.
Yeah, it seems to run through, every culture, everywhere in the world. And if you look at it, and trace it all the way back to the Bible, it's even there. And at the same time, gender disparity was very prominent in my own life, as I'm sure it is in the lives of many of your listeners who are women. They recognize that because of their gender, they are under certain restrictions, or they do not have certain privileges that they would have if perhaps they were male.
And so that was a little bit about, or is that where your idea for writing the Thesaurus came from?
Well, what happened with my writing, when I did go on then and, major in women's studies for my master's degree, as you mentioned, and when I graduated, I had just assumed, we are now in 2003, and I had just assumed that I would teach women's studies. And I was very excited about doing this because I had learned so much about my own history that I was not aware of, and I wanted to share this now with everybody. It's kind of like, when you read a good book or see a good movie, you just want to tell everybody you know about it. You can't wait. You're just bursting at the seams. Well, that's kind of how I was. But at the time, education cuts were being made across the board. And women's studies, of course, is not a required course. It's an elective. So I very early on realized that, teaching women's studies wasn't going to happen for me at the time, and it was very disappointing. At the time, I also was a member of AAUW, the local branch, and they had a printed monthly newsletter. So I just simply said, would you like a women's history column for your newsletter? And if you have a newsletter, or don't, anybody who does, you're always looking for copy, for it. So they said yes, and I began writing a column, once a month. And after a few months, it was suggested that it go online. Well, speaking of your empowerment show, which I am on right now, this was very empowering for me, very, very empowering, because I realized that rather than teaching women's studies to 10 or 15 women, let's say, in a classroom, semester after semester after semester, my women's history could now be accessed, not that it would be, but it could be, by all women, all over the world, anywhere they happen to be, because it would be online. So that in itself was very, very empowering me. So I kept writing the column. I was getting a lot of nice feedback on it. I kept doing it. And eventually it just, after we're at 10 years now, I've been doing it for 10 years, and as time went on, it became apparent that I needed a book. Because I was writing about so many women across so many different disciplines and areas, science, math, physics, literature, that it wasn't like writing a biography of someone where you get to know that person through and through. I couldn't remember all the names, all the facts, all of everything. So I really needed a book in my hand so I could have it with me. And I needed the book for women who do not go online. And so that's kind of how the book was born. But the columns are still online. I invite all your listeners to go online and read it if they like. It's a real easy access. There is no login, no password to remember. You just go on the AAW website and click on my columns and choose the one you like and sit back, put your feet up, and enjoy.
Well, let's talk about some of there's so much that I want to talk about here, and I know that I'm kind of jumping back and forth, but I think this would be a great time to talk about some of the women that you've outlined in your book, because there's some really amazing stories that you share that I really don't think are common knowledge. So are there some women in that thesaurus that kind of stand out for you?
Well, I could name a lot of women, but you probably would not know them, which is why I really write my history. My history centers around exposing or unmasking women. I say these women are masked because you know about their accomplishments. As you say, there are a lot of wonderful stories in this book and in my columns. But we know the places, we know the things, we know the accomplishments of these women, but we don't really know the women themselves. We don't know the names. We're not familiar with them. For example, the Brooklyn Bridge. The civil engineer on the Brooklyn Bridge was a woman. This was something I did not know. It was a personal awareness for me. I happened to be on a cruise one year, and I was walking up on the cruise line. I was walking up the stairs, and here was this big, huge picture of the Brooklyn Bridge, and it's like, I saw it, and I just at that moment, I felt so empowered because I knew of the connection of a woman to that bridge. Well, not many women know that, and I want them to know that. I want them to feel that empowerment that I felt.
Absolutely, and I think that was something that really stood out to me, was that there were many stories that you covered that women either were robbed of their part and participation in some wonderful things that happen in the world. Like I think you mentioned that the Nobel Prize for the DNA helix was given to 3 male counterparts because they had actually, is it that they stole her photograph?
Correct. This is Rosalind Franklin, and there's a wonderful book, a total book written about her, and I think it's called The Lady of Dark Matter. Rosalind Franklin was a physicist, and they were studying RNA and DNA back in I think it was 1950s or so. And she had 3 gentlemen as her lab mates. And she had an X-ray technology photograph. And now, again, this was before we knew what DNA was, before the helix was formed. This was before we had any of the knowledge that we have today. So she had the film and was studying it microscopically. There's actually a photo of her in my book doing this. And the 3 gentlemen stole this photograph from her lab. And from this photograph, they produced the double helix, which would have happened eventually, including her. She unfortunately passed away quite young, and the Nobel Prizes are not awarded to posthumously. They're only awarded to living recipients. And so the 3 gentlemen earned the Nobel Prize for her, for the double helix of DNA, which really began with her. that said, I like to celebrate these women. I don't like my stories to be sad or unhappy. And even though this did happen to her recently, a medical school in Chicago, up in Evanston area, Chicago Medical School, was named after her, the Rosalind Franklin Medical School. So that has a happy ending, I think, eventually.
I do like that as well. I know that some of the stories that really resonated with me could be seen as negative, but for me and my generation, I grew up after the 60s, 70s, and the women's revolution, which we can debate whether or not or how that happened. But I think that I took a lot of things for granted, and that there's still, and unfortunately still to this day, many women who are not being given the recognition that they deserve. And it might have been more blatant back in the day, but I think there's still a lot of it that is rampant in corporate America or in other areas where women really aren't recognized for their contributions.
Yeah, this is very, very true, Melissa, very true. And I think that, the younger women do take a lot for granted from what the feminists of, let's say, the 60s and so did and marched for and achieved for them. At the same time, I don't want to fault them for that, because I think that the women of the 60s, they also took for granted a lot of what went on before them in terms of the suffrage movement. A lot of women, we don't even know that history. Women don't know about the suffrage movement in detail or what actually happened during those early years. So I think this is just sort of true, generational as we talk about it. But one woman I would like to mention, if you would like, would be, and I won't tell you her name right off the bat, but I will tell you that back in the 1920s, she wanted to be a surgeon. And she went to medical school. She received her medical degree from Columbia University, College of Physicians and Surgeons. She completed her residency, and she set up a surgical practice in 1937. But it was not to succeed because the male doctors of the day would not refer their patients to a female surgeon. So the chief of surgery didn't really help or support her, but he suggested instead that she practice anesthesiology, which back then was considered nursing. It wasn't even considered to be a doctorate type of work in the medical field. But it got her out of his surgery department. He didn't need to deal with her, and she did end up working in anesthesiology. As well, she began researching and studying newborns, which, as you know, the mortality rate for newborns was not good. Babies were dying at birth quite regularly. And what happened, this doctor went on and on. I won't tell you the middle of the story. You can go and read that for yourself, but I'll skip to the end and tell you that she eventually developed a test that I believe you may have had at birth, and many of your listeners may have had at birth. It's called the Epcar test. And this test was named after Dr. Virginia Epcar, who nowadays every baby born in every hospital since the 1950s, every hospital around the world receives the Epcar test, all due to a woman, Virginia Epcar. And this really came was called to my attention recently. Several women have mentioned this doctor, like, oh, I didn't know the Epcar score was from a woman. So that was back in the 30s, and the reason I mention this, as we're talking about the younger generation, one of the reasons I do want younger women to read their history as well as older women, because the women's history has really been kept from all of us. But we fast forward that story to 1969, and history repeats itself. And it repeats itself today, as you mentioned. There's still a lot of gender discrimination going on and disparity. But in 1969, another young lady wanted to be a surgeon. She wanted to be a brain surgeon. Her college counselor told her that women aren't doctors, women are nurses, and he would not sign off on her pre-med courses. So this woman, by the name of Susie Orman, majored in social work. And we all know what she went on to do, but we don't know much about the gender obstacle that Susie Orman had to overcome. But she did overcome it, and that's the big point of my of my women's history, that all of these women did meet gender obstacles somewhere along the way, but they all overcame them and they did what they could. And young women can do it too.
I agree with that. It's kind of interesting too, and I don't know the exact year, but I had another woman who was on the show, the empowerment show, who wanted to be a doctor as well, and was told that women can't be doctors, and she ended up being trained in veterinary medicine, and then later in life did go back and get a chiropractic and applied kinesiology degree. And what is interesting, I think, about these three women in the medical profession was, even though they didn't take the direct route, they kind of got rerouted in what their passion was, they still had amazing contributions that actually they may not have had they not gotten distracted.
Very good point. You're right. Very good point. They created their own path. They made their own footprints in the sand, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And it's kind of interesting. I'd love to get an idea from you. Why do you think that women's history has been minimized? You know, why do they not usually appear in their history books alongside men? Is that something that you found as you've gone through your research?
Oh, yes. And if I knew the answer to why, if anybody knew the answer to why, it would be a different world. But, there are a couple of theories and a couple of thoughts about it, and, I'll just mention a couple, and you can choose anyone that you like. I think in terms of writing history itself, the male authors of history simply didn't think to include women's history. Or B, the male authors of history deliberately decided not to include women's history. And women themselves were not writing the history of the day. So, I think when you take all that and you look at it together, a lot of the times things that women did, they weren't considered to be, let's say, historic. I actually do have another very good example of that, if you like. Well, it has to do with the Montgomery Bus Boycott that I suspect you are familiar with, or most of you listeners are. When I did my women's studies graduate work at Roosevelt, a woman named Darlene Clark Hine, who is the renowned African-American women's history historian, was coming to Roosevelt to teach a class, and I was instructed by my superiors there that I would take her class because she was so renowned. And so I did. And I was sitting in this African-American women's history class learning about African-American women's history. And Dr. Clark kindly mentioned Joanna Robinson having started the Montgomery Bus Boycott. And I just sat there kind of silent and in shock. I had just completed 4 semesters of African-American history in my undergrad, not women's history, but history, and I didn't remember that name. So I didn't say anything in class, but I went home and I referenced my book, and Joanna Robinson in that history book got 1/2 a sentence, and it didn't even have to do with the Montgomery Bus Boycott. Well, what Joanna Robinson did the night that Rosa Parks was arrested, Joanna Robinson at the time was a professor at the University or Atlanta State University in Montgomery, Alabama State University in Montgomery. And the night that Rosa Parks was arrested, Joanna Robinson and 2 of her colleagues went in the basement of the university and they mimeographed 52,000 pamphlets urging blacks to stay off the buses. Now, blacks did that, and whites joined with blacks, and everyone stayed off the buses. And what happened eventually is that the United States Supreme Court ruled that the buses in the South would be desegregated. This is Joanna Robinson desegregated the buses. Do you know how important that is? And she wasn't even mentioned during the African American history courses I was taking. So was she overlooked? Was she deliberately? Your guess is as good as mine, but she was.
That is just an absolutely amazing story, not only for what that woman did, but that even in specialized minority studies that women are left out as well. it's interesting to see that women are still, in many ways, more of a minority, or treated more as a minority than other cultures. And it's
exactly, and that's exactly what I said at the beginning of the broadcast. You know, when you asked me, and I was studying the history of minorities all across the board, and I saw women in all of these minority cultures or classes being subjected, you know, to men across the board. Mm-hmm. And there is a full book out now about Joanna Robinson, which she wrote, you know, in the Montgomery Boycott, and it describes all of this. And why is that overlooked in our general history books? I don't know, but it is.
Which is why it's wonderful that you have a book out and that others are putting books out to bring women and their contributions into the light. And if you want to give some information on where people can get your book, A Thesaurus of Women from Cherry Blossoms to Cell Phones.
Well, the book, as you say, it is available at all independent bookstores. It is a self-published book, so it does need to be ordered, but it also can be ordered online, and it is in ebook form at Amazon and Barnes & Noble. And you're also able to get it directly from me if you want to email me or check with my website.
And I encourage people to do so. There's many fascinating stories that you've been able to find and uncover and share with us. And I just wanted to talk to you a little bit about, hopefully things are changing. I know Malala Yousafzai, which I know I ruined her name, but she's been getting a lot of press lately. I was wondering if she would be a good candidate for inclusion for your next book.
Well, Malala is a good and wonderful little person, and we are blessed to have such an icon in our midst. But she would not be a candidate for my book because you do already know about her. And I write about women that you do not already know about, women but whose accomplishments you do know. So Malala, I think, will be written about in the future. She's written about right now, and hopefully she will not be forgotten. But if perchance she is, I would suspect that someone 100 years from now will write about her, as I am writing about women who are 100 years prior to her. But aren't we lucky to have her?
Absolutely, absolutely. Hopefully there will be more of her and more reception to individual women and their contributions, so that the work that you do, you can continue to look at the past 100 years and not have to look at the future 100 years, that will be able to make a difference.
Yes, absolutely. And also I think as women, you know, such as myself, are writing more history. We are writing about women's history. We do feel it's important. It is not marginalized in our writing as it is, you know, in the history writings of some of the men who are writing. I don't think men just really, in a lot of ways, they don't think about the fact that women have done important things.
I think that is the case. I had some wonderful women, Babes with Blades Theater Company, on earlier this year, and they're finding very much the same minimization in the arts, in theater and movies and television, as you were finding in the history books. And I don't know if we can ever know if it's intentional, but it's definitely apparent, and I think it's important for us as consumers to be aware of it and to start demanding to see women in their true roles and their true contributions, because we are partners in this world, and it's important not to leave out 50% of the population.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I couldn't agree with you more. And I think, you know, again, as more and more women are becoming more public in what they do and where they go, and the movies that they see, and the books that they read, you know, and giving more credibility to women, to women's work, to women's advancement in the arts, you know, in science, in whatever, that this will become much more prominent. Absolutely. And much more equitable.
And it is very important work that you're doing, along with the support of the AAUW and many other groups. The Chicago Women in Publishing Group, I know, was very important to you to be able to get this book published. So it is fantastic that there is support for you and other authors to be able to get these stories out.
Yes, thank you. You know, AAUW, the mission of AAUW, the letters stand for the American Association of University Women, And they were organized in 1881 literally to help and to support college graduates who were women, because women could not go to college prior to basically 1831, when Oberlin first opened its doors to women and started accepting women's applications to college. So as women were graduating in the late 1800s, they didn't have, any support, and they were not welcomed in society. They were thought to be a brazen woman, let's say. So AAUW is very adamant about supporting higher education for girls. And when I started writing my column, as I mentioned, it was kind of accidental. I didn't intend to do this. I didn't have any real training in journalism or writing or editing or publishing. And that's when I joined the Chicago Women in Publishing group, who were very, very, very instrumental in helping me gain the knowledge that I needed to know about how I was going to move forward and get a book published, which at one point in my journey, I realized it was very, very important to have it in print. And another organization that I then ended up joining is the Illinois Women's Press Association, which is, again, a wonderful support organization for any women in the field. And whatever the field be, I would suggest to all women that they get involved with some women's group or organization some way, somehow, in whatever field they are in, because women can be a very supportive and encouraging group for you if you are doing any kind of work and need someone to support you.
Thank you so much for your time today, Barbara. We loved having you on, and I look forward to reading more in the Thesaurus of Women from Cherry Blossoms to Cell Phones.
Oh, thank you very much, Melissa. Thank you for the time. It was a pleasure to be here.
Join Melissa Heisler next week right here at The Empowerment Show. Join the conversation at facebook.com/The Empowerment Show or twitter.com/Empowerment Show.